It seems like Hoyo is wasting no time creating new archetypes of units. Having recently discussed the Nihility Squad being developed in March, succeeded by multiple follow-up attack-oriented units in April and early May, and now we have a new team strategy that began to emerge in 2.2 and is being fully realized in 2.3, break damage. Weakness break has been a staple mechanic throughout Honkai Star's combat from the game's maiden voyage, and while it was important from the start, incorporating tactical uses for it has only become more necessitated over time. For most endgame content, finding the right set of characters that can efficiently take on every cycle is the main challenge of this game, and players have been giving a lot of attention to parties that can perform competently in a wide variety of scenarios. So far, the follow-up attack, damage over time, and Acheron hypercarry niches have been dominating the meta, owing to great synergy between its carries and supports. With the release of Boothill just last version and the extremely long-awaited debut of our precious mass murderer Cinnamon Roll Firefly, it seems the newest challenger in this rapidly advancing metagame is break teams, but how well do they stack against the competition? Can they live up to their name and break the meta, or are they just a gimmicky rogue strategy and not worth investing into? Today we'll be discussing the break niche as a whole, listing its current members, detailing its strengths and weaknesses, along with future speculation on how it could mature or decline. Break damage adheres to a different set of rules than most other damaging forms, so for thoroughness, let's start by outlining all of its characteristics. Conventional wisdom understands the importance of type coverage in Honkai Star. The white bar displayed above every enemy, aka the toughness gauge, depletes whenever struck by a move corresponding to one of the elements listed above it. Every source of active damage deals a set amount of toughness damage. To my knowledge, every non-modified basic attack deals 30, for example. This can be further increased through character-specific buffs or through break efficiency. While said toughness gauge is active, all incoming damage regardless of element or type is reduced by 10%, giving players the pragmatic incentive to break toughness gauges while dealing damage to their actual health. More importantly though, weakness breaks represent a crucial aspect of combat that can drastically influence how comfortably you proceed with each turn. Fully destroying a target's toughness gauge will deal what's known as break damage, an isolated instance of damage and a debuff based on the element of the attack triggering it. Additionally, on top of now removing the 10% damage mitigation, weakness breaks delay enemy actions by 25%, and when timed correctly have the ability to cancel enemy actions, acting as a sort of crowd control or disruption effect. In other words, breaks have offensive and defensive applications, either of which being the single determining factor between success or failure. Physical, fire, lightning, and wind damage apply the respective dot effects, bleed, burn, shock, and wind shear respectively, while ice applies the freeze effect, skipping the target's current turn altogether while advancing their next turn forward by 50%. Quantum implies entanglement, following a somewhat similar action delay premise, and imaginary implies imprisonment, which also delays enemy action but further lowers their speed by 10% afterwards. Outside of dot teams, players collectively agreed that imprisonment and entanglement are considered the most effective breaks of the 7 elements for their consistent delays in action. However, in terms of actual break damage itself, physical and fire are the strongest. While we're on the subject of damage, break damage does not directly scale off of stats like attack, crit rate, crit damage, or elemental damage bonuses of any kind. Rather, it follows a formula independent from the user, outside of select circumstances. Basically, you can think of weakness break as transformative elemental reaction damage from Genshin. It's not a direct one-to-one comparison, but that's sort of the best way I can describe it. While it takes a character attacking an enemy to decide what type of weakness break is inflicted and such, the actual source of the break is a separate occurrence. Kind of like how damage over time being a debuff occurs separately, hence why it doesn't lower toughness gauges. In any case, just like how Elemental Mastery increases the damage of elemental reactions, break damage has 3 primary metrics of scaling: level, the enemy's max toughness, and break effect, the stat that shares the most resemblance with Elemental Mastery. Without getting too deep into the math and whatnot, there are other ways to theoretically increase break damage universally, such as by lowering the defense or resistance of the target before weakness break is applied. Notably, following the release of Harmony Trailblazer, there's a new mechanic known as super break damage, a variation of break damage dealt by certain abilities. This type of break damage is only applied when targets are already in a weakness broken state, during which attacks essentially convert the toughness damage they would normally do on a target with an active toughness gauge into bonus damage. Think about it like this: you take that instance of break damage on a target, the one they suffer when their toughness bar reaches 0, and every single super break reapplies that same break damage. With Super Break being introduced alongside Harmony MC, they very clearly demonstrate the potential use cases of this. With their ultimate, Harmony MC gives everyone 30% break effect and super break damage on every attack. All attacks against weakness broken enemies deal super break damage on top of their normal damage. The presence of Super Break gives you a way to further weaponize break effect. Now, instead of only that single instance of damage upon breaking enemies and that's it, you can reapply that instance of damage over and over and over and over until the enemy regains their toughness gauge, practically turning your entire team into damage dealers. That is about as simple as I can describe Super Break. Prior to Harmony Trailblazer, we had a few characters with the modicum of break-related things in their kit. Silver Wolf, Acheron, Shuei, and Ranmei could break enemies or deal break damage regardless of their elemental vulnerabilities, making them situationally usable even if the enemy had no quantum, lightning, and/or ice vulnerability. Silver Wolf, however, is less about break damage and the subsequent effects that come with it, and more about breaking toughness gauges in the first place, as evident by her being able to implant a random vulnerability based on a team composition. Runmei, on the other hand, has a fair bit of interactions with breaks. For one, her damage buff increases based on her break effect. Meanwhile, her talent deals additional break damage equal to her own break damage anytime she or an ally destroys the target's toughness. Furthermore, she can extend the weakness break duration of enemies with her ultimate, dealing even further break damage, and her A2 trace gives 20% break effect to her entire party. While that has always been her niche, Runmei has also provided many all-purpose effects that people took more notice of, leaving her break-related stuff as more of an extra perk than the centerpiece of her kit, at least before 2.2. There were more units with stats or abilities that pertain to breaks, including Gallagher, whose talent in conjunction with his ultimate causes enemies to take bonus break damage, or Shuei, who gets more break effect on an E4 along with universal toughness reducing attacks. It wasn't until Harmony MC though when the break niche became fully realized, as prior to that, there were characters with break effect or break related things, but no one who could channel all of that towards a win condition, and more importantly, no one who could take charge. Not too long ago we got Boothill, the first character who explicitly follows a break-oriented strategy. Not only can he shred toughness gauges at record time, but he deals huge amounts of break damage with his talent, while also gaining additional power on his normal damage through his A2 trace, converting break effect into crit stats. Something imperative to mention is that his ultimate and technique both have the ability to implant a physical weakness on his target of choice, making him the second character after Silver Wolf with the ability to forcibly apply elemental vulnerabilities. And don't worry, he won't be the last one either. Harmony MC and Boothill already demonstrate the sheer destructive capabilities of break damage in their own respective ways, the former basically having the ability to turn the entire cast into break damage bots if they wanted to, and the latter possessing arguably the highest single target DPS in the game under the right conditions. But things are about to heat up even more with the release of our darling Firefly. Firefly is another break-oriented character. More specifically, she's the second character who can apply super break damage to enemies, and she might also be the first character with a power level strong enough to rival Acheron's. The central idea behind Firefly, aka Sam, is to prime her ultimate as often as possible to access her enhanced attacks, not unlike physical Trailblazer's ultimate. During Firefly's ultimate, she gains bonus break efficiency and deals 20% more break damage. Speaking of which, the damage of her empowered blast attack also scales off break effect, making her effectively a hybrid scaler where you can build her via crit stats and break effect. Technically, she has reciprocal scaling. Her A2 trace gives her bonus break effect based on her attack above 1800, so you can build break effect on her to increase her damage, and you can also build attack on her to gain more break effect as well. Just like her fellow breaker Boothill, Firefly has the ability to implant fire weaknesses on enemies through either her empowered blast attack or her technique. Although unlike Boothill's technique, hers can apply a fire weakness to all enemies every single wave, making her excel in either single or multi-wave fights. Said technique will be especially helpful for brute forcing your way through all manner of MOC, Pure Fiction, and Daepoch Shadow. Even against enemies without a fire weakness, Firefly can still shred toughness gauges. She can basically cover every situation. She can forcibly implant fire weaknesses on enemies, she can deal tons of damage either against a single target or versus small groups of enemies, and scales off virtually every single offensive stat in the game. On a side note, remember when I said that the fire and physical elements have the strongest base break damage? How coincidental is it that Firefly and Boothill are fire and physical? Like I briefly mentioned when introducing her, it would be no exaggeration to say that Firefly's power is extremely close to Acheron, if not outright stronger with Eidolons. So while narratively there's no chance in hell Sam would have survived Acheron in single combat, in terms of gameplay, that standoff between them in Penacony's Dreamscape might have foreshadowed the eventual playable release of Firefly and how strong she would be. Now, having given a brief overview of all parties involved with break teams, let's go into the second half of the video and outline the strengths and weaknesses. Concerning the present meta, break units have a commanding presence right from the get-go. With Harmony MC in the equation, Gallagher is shot out from a niche healer to on par with Locha in effectiveness, choosing a more offensive route than Mr. AOK healer. Boothill has already cemented himself as one of the best single-target DPS units in the game, if not the absolute best, and Firefly has effectively eclipsed Lunai Danheng and Jingliu, pushing the ceiling of destruction to even greater heights. Is this because of the break niche being strong, or is it just a result of the characters themselves? Beginning with the positives, since break damage follows a different formula that effectively means, on a fundamental level, you can fully ignore stats like attack, crit rate, crit damage and such. Even elemental damage on planar ornaments don't matter. This makes building them extremely simple. The only stat you really need for break damage is break effect main stat on your rope, and of course as much break effect as you can get via subs on the rest of your relics. Even more so than dot teams, break teams are extremely easy to build as they need only one stat for the bulk of their damage. Now, to be fair, our two main break-focused attackers, Boothill and Firefly, still depend on attack and crit stats, considering they still do a fair bit of normal damage. However, by and large, the break niche itself does not care for crit stats or even attack in the slightest, so if in the future more break-focused units come out, preferably those who can apply super break damage, they will likely be the easiest units to gear up compared to most others. Second positive aspect of break teams is that their objective of shattering toughness gauges left and right aligns with the player's desire to want to do that already. Even before 2.2 and 2.3, weakness breaks have been top priority not only to maximize their damage output, but to prevent enemies from performing their combos and attacks as well. With everyone in your team shredding toughness gauges, you'll practically have the ability to insta-break anyone on the enemy team regardless of type, making break teams not only efficient but safe as well. Assuming you're able to kill off every enemy within one weakness break, you might even be able to run a no-sustain party and just burst them all in one go by compounding super break damage on top of each other. Third positive, coverage. One of the hallmark aspects of a top meta team is how meta resilient they are. Can they be used in a wide variety of scenarios no matter the weakness types, cycle blessings and whatnot? For break teams, that's a definitive yes. Firefly and Boothill can both apply their own weakness types, theoretically making them usable against all manner of enemies. Obviously, you should still pay attention to cycle blessings and not just assume you can spam Firefly or Boothill into everything, but if you're in a pinch, break teams can be a decent brute force option to a certain extent. Now, let's talk about the negatives. First and foremost, we should address the elephant in the room, their dependence on causing weakness breaks. This is less of an issue for Firefly as she has a lot of normal damage in her kit, being a hybrid between a breaker and a regular attacker, but as a whole, the break niche has one critical flaw in that their DPS, especially when accounting for super break damage, gets completely shut down if the enemy team has some way to lock their toughness gauge. More often than not, you'll come across a boss who can grant themselves a shield preventing you from breaking them until you meet a special condition. Ironically, one of those bosses happens to be Sam. If and when this happens, anyone reliant on super break damage or break damage in general become pragmatically useless, as in their DPS drops to virtually zero. Super break damage can only apply to weakness broken enemies, which can't happen if the targets protect themselves from being broken. This is basically the one weakness of break teams, but it's a very critical and relevant weakness. To be fair, other teams do also have blind spots that can disrupt their game plan. Dot teams might have trouble against enemies with high effect res, since damage over time is ultimately a debuff, but you can circumvent this by stacking tons of effect hit rate on your characters or by reducing effect res on enemies yourselves. Follow-up attackers are extremely dependent on each other for uptime. If the enemy has any kind of trapping or lockdown mechanics such as a memory zone meme or Svarog, follow teams will suffer a greater loss of DPS than most others. Hypothetically, if Topaz gets compromised, Aventurine, Dr. Ratio, and Robin all lose damage, whereas if Fushuen gets compromised, Akron likely would be none the wiser to it. That being said, those situations are still few and far between compared to the number of enemies who can lock toughness gauges, and even then you can always debuff the enemy or work around their mechanic in some way, shape, or form. For break teams, depending on the condition and depending on who your main attacker is, you might not have any way of responding to this, rendering the entire party dead on arrival. You can always remedy the issue by killing them before they get a chance to use it, but in fairness, that's a universal strategy. The strongest crowd control after all is death. There's also one more drawback that pertains to right now, but will probably be alleviated in the future. Because of how picky break units are with their stats, there aren't many light cone options for them right now. I touched on that in my problem with light cones video last week, where Boothill is kind of screwed by the complete absence of alternative weapon choices if you can't afford a signature weapon. Fortunately, being a destruction character, Firefly has Misha's indelible promise to use as a fallback, but realistically you don't have a whole lot to work with. Hopefully in the future that gets addressed a bit. So those are some weak points that make the break niche not as all-purpose or as accessible as they would otherwise be, but in totality the strengths considerably outweigh the weaknesses. Break teams are definitely going to be meta relevant. Weakness breaks are a vital component to Honkai Star Rail's gameplay, so characters who capitalize on and amplify the effects of it will naturally be quite valuable. Overall, I think it's a very fun playstyle that, given more development and characters, will be just as competitive as the game's current dominant teams. TLDR, pull for Firefly. She's cute, she's adorable, she's a cinnamon roll, and she has a PhD in ass whooping. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. If you guys enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and why not check out my analysis on follow-up units if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.